March 28, 1945. Near Frankfurt, Germany. A German general reached into his leather holster, pulled out a loaded pistol, and held it out across the table. For a split second, nobody understood what they were seeing. The room smelled of wet wool, cigarette smoke, and mud carried in on soldiers' boots. Rain hammered against the windows. American guards shifted their weight. One man's hand moved toward his rifle. Then General Patton looked down at the weapon. He did not flinch. He did not stand. He did not say a word. The German general kept the pistol extended between them, his face unreadable, his jaw tight. Every man in that room knew one wrong move could turn a surrender meeting into a bloodbath. Patton slowly reached forward. The guards froze. The German general smiled. And what happened next has never been fully told. Until now. If this kind of real history matters to you, the stories they never taught you in school, subscribe before we go any further. It costs nothing and it tells us this work matters. March 28, 1945. The rain had been falling since before dawn. Near Frankfurt, Germany, the temperature hovered just above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Low gray clouds pressed against the horizon. The roads were rivers of mud churned by tanks, trucks, and thousands of boots moving east toward the collapsing heart of the Third Reich. The war was entering its final weeks. General George S. Patton's Third Army had smashed through German defenses faster than many Allied commanders believed possible. Entire German units were surrendering. Others fought with the desperation of men who knew there was nowhere left to retreat. But not everyone intended to surrender quietly. At 7:15 that morning, 20-year-old Private First Class James Walker stepped from the back of a supply truck and into the cold rain. Walker came from Topeka, Kansas. He had been in Europe for 118 days. Inside his jacket pocket was a folded photograph of his fiancée, Margaret. The edges were worn from being handled so often. The night before, he had written her another letter. "I think this war is nearly over," he wrote. "Maybe by summer I'll finally be home." He had no idea how wrong he was. Walker belonged to a security detachment assigned to assist with a high-level meeting involving captured German officers. Most soldiers viewed the assignment as easy duty. They were mistaken. By March 1945, Allied intelligence officers were collecting evidence of concentration camps, mass executions, and systematic atrocities committed across occupied Europe. Reports arrived daily. Entire villages destroyed, prisoners shot without trial, civilians murdered by retreating units. Behind many of those crimes stood senior officers who now hoped to negotiate favorable treatment before Germany's inevitable defeat. One of them was Generalleutnant Karl Reinhardt. Officially, Reinhardt was a respected corps commander responsible for defending key transportation routes west of Frankfurt. Unofficially, intelligence files painted a darker picture. Witnesses connected units under his command to executions of captured prisoners during the winter of 1944. Several reports described orders that ignored the Geneva Convention entirely. Yet Reinhardt remained confident, arrogantly confident. He believed American commanders wanted quick victories more than justice. He believed men like Patton could be manipulated. And most dangerously of all, he believed he understood Patton. What happened next would prove how badly he had misjudged the man sitting across from him. As darkness approached that evening, rainwater dripped from damaged rooftops and pooled around the headquarters building where the meeting would take place. Armed guards checked every entrance. Telephone operators worked without pause. Staff officers moved through narrow corridors carrying intelligence reports and surrender documents. Inside one room, a wooden table waited. Inside another, Patton reviewed the latest battlefield updates. His jaw remained tight. His eyes rarely left the reports, because the men being murdered by German units were the same kind of soldiers he commanded every day. Young men, farm boys, factory workers, men carrying photographs from home, men like James Walker. What Walker did not know yet was that General Reinhardt had already set a dangerous plan into motion. And by the time he found out, it was already too late to stop what was coming. March 29, 1945. The rain finally stopped just after sunrise. Cold mist hung over the fields outside Frankfurt. Water dripped from shattered trees. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel fuel, and smoke from distant artillery. At 8:12 that morning, Generalleutnant Karl Reinhardt arrived under armed escort. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War, a career officer who had embraced the Nazi regime when it advanced his career. Before the war, Reinhardt had been considered ambitious. During the war, he became something else. Useful. Documents later linked units under his authority to reprisal executions in occupied territories. Villages suspected of aiding resistance groups were burned. Hostages disappeared. Prisoners were shot after surrendering. Instead of punishment, Reinhardt received promotions, medals, command authority. The regime rewarded results, not mercy. As American intelligence officers reviewed captured files, a darker pattern emerged. Reports suggested Reinhardt had personally signed orders authorizing actions that violated international law. Yet he showed no fear, only confidence. Inside the headquarters building, Private James Walker watched from a hallway security post. His fingers tightened around his rifle as the German officers passed. None of them looked defeated. That bothered him. What happened next made him even more uneasy. The meeting began at 9 a.m. Patton sat at one end of a long wooden table. Reinhardt sat at the other. Several American officers stood nearby taking notes. For nearly 15 minutes, neither man raised his voice. Then Reinhardt made his move. Reinhardt, General Patton, Germany is finished. We both know that. Patton, go on. Reinhardt, then perhaps practical men should discuss practical arrangements. Patton's eyes narrowed. The room grew quieter. Reinhardt leaned forward. Reinhardt, a commander such as yourself, understands necessity. Patton, necessity is often the excuse used by cowards. One American officer lowered his pencil. Nobody interrupted. Reinhardt forced a smile. Reinhardt, he folded his hands. Then perhaps we should discuss mutual interests. Patton, our interests are not mutual. Reinhardt, you need order after the war. Patton, I need surrender. Unconditional surrender. The German general's jaw tightened. For the first time, the confidence slipped. Only slightly. But Patton noticed. Patton was not reacting emotionally. He was studying him, calculating, measuring every word, every glance, every hesitation. Outside, military police searched Reinhardt's vehicles. That was when the first shocking discovery appeared. At 10:17 a.m., officers found a sealed leather portfolio hidden beneath a rear compartment. Inside were documents, lists of names, execution reports, transfer orders, evidence that connected senior officers to crimes far beyond what Allied investigators had previously suspected. The discovery changed everything. Suddenly, this was no longer a routine surrender discussion. It was a potential war crimes case. Inside the meeting room, Reinhardt had no idea the documents had been found. He continued speaking as if he still controlled the situation. But the balance of power had already shifted, and when an intelligence officer quietly entered the room carrying a folder marked confidential, Patton understood exactly what he was looking at. He read the first page, then the second, then a third. His expression never changed. That frightened the officers around him more than anger would have, because they knew Patton had just learned something important. What Reinhardt did not know was that the evidence in that folder threatened not only his freedom, but the carefully constructed lie that had protected him throughout the war. And within the next few hours, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. March 29, 1945, 11:41 a.m. The headquarters building had grown strangely quiet. Outside, a cold wind pushed low clouds across the German countryside. Water dripped from damaged gutters. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like distant thunder. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere had changed completely. The intelligence folder sat in front of Patton, closed, untouched, waiting. Generalleutnant Karl Reinhardt noticed it immediately, and he made a critical mistake. He assumed he could still control the conversation. The German general leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His posture projected confidence. His expression suggested a man negotiating from strength rather than one sitting in enemy custody. Patton watched him carefully, not speaking, not moving, just watching. The silence stretched. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Finally, Reinhardt broke it. "Reinhardt, I assume your officers have discovered something interesting." Patton looked up. "Patton, more interesting than you realize." A muscle twitched in Reinhardt's jaw. For the first time, uncertainty appeared. Only for a moment. Then it vanished. The German general decided to gamble. A dangerous gamble. One that would destroy everything. Reinhardt, war requires difficult decisions. Patton, murder requires decisions too. The room froze. Several officers exchanged glances. Nobody smiled. Nobody wrote notes. Nobody shifted in their seats. The temperature inside felt colder than before. Patton slowly opened the folder. Page after page contained signatures, orders, execution reports, witness statements, names, dates, places, evidence, the kind of evidence that survives long after excuses disappear. At 11:49 a.m., another officer entered carrying fresh intelligence from recently liberated territory. Patton read the report. Then he read it again. His face remained expressionless, but those who knew him recognized the warning signs. The tightened jaw, the narrowed eyes, the absolute stillness. Private James Walker was standing outside the room when he saw a colonel emerge carrying several documents. The colonel looked pale. Walker had seen combat. He had seen wounded men. He had seen fear, but he had never seen a senior officer look like that. Something terrible was happening inside. What happened next shifted the entire confrontation. The new intelligence directly connected Reinhardt's command to the execution of Allied prisoners during the winter fighting. Not rumors, not assumptions, specific evidence, specific victims, specific orders. Patton closed the folder, slowly, deliberately. Then he stood. The room immediately felt smaller. Reinhardt remained seated. That was another mistake. Patton walked to the window. Rainwater still clung to the glass. Outside, American vehicles moved through muddy roads toward the front. Young soldiers, men like James Walker, men who followed orders, men who trusted their commanders. Patton turned back toward the table. His eyes locked onto Reinhardt. For 17 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was a loose window frame rattling in the wind. Every person present understood that something significant was about to happen. Not because Patton looked angry, because he looked calm, dangerously calm. Then Reinhardt made one final attempt to seize control. One final move. A move that would lead directly to the moment people would talk about for decades. He slowly reached toward his side, toward an object nobody expected him to have. Several American officers stiffened. A guard took half a step forward. Patton did not move, did not blink, did not speak. As Reinhardt's hand disappeared beneath his coat, every man in that room suddenly realized that the next few seconds could end in violence. And then the German general pulled something from his holster, something made of steel, something fully loaded. And for one terrifying moment, nobody could believe what they were seeing. March 29, 1945. 11:52 a.m. The room went silent. Reinhardt's hand emerged from beneath his coat, holding a German Walther pistol. Loaded. For an instant, nobody moved. An American captain reached for his sidearm. A military policeman tensed near the door. Private James Walker, watching through the partially open doorway, felt his pulse hammer against his neck. Then something unexpected happened. The German general did not aim the weapon. Instead, he turned the grip toward Patton and placed the pistol on the table between them. The metallic sound echoed through the room. Click. Nobody breathed. Reinhardt leaned forward. A faint smile crossed his face. He thought he had regained control. Reinhardt, a soldier, should understand another soldier. Patton said nothing. Reinhardt, take it. No response. Reinhardt, you know what war demands. Patton's eyes never left him. The German general pushed the pistol forward. Reinhardt, one pull of the trigger solves many problems. Several officers stared in disbelief. What was Reinhardt suggesting? Suicide? An execution? A test? No one could be certain. That uncertainty made the moment even more dangerous. Patton slowly stepped toward the table. The room tightened. Walker felt his hands sweating despite the cold. Reinhardt mistook Patton's calm for hesitation. That was his greatest mistake. Villains often underestimate heroes. Reinhardt underestimated Patton completely. The German general believed every man had a price. Every commander had a breaking point. Every war produced compromises. But Patton had spent months watching young Americans die across Europe. He had buried too many soldiers to be manipulated by a man whose signature appeared on execution orders. Patton stopped beside the table. His eyes moved from the pistol to Reinhardt, then back again. For 11 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was rainwater dripping from a damaged gutter outside the headquarters building. Then Patton picked up the pistol. Gasps filled the room. Reinhardt smiled. He thought he had won. He had not. Patton checked the weapon, opened the chamber, verified the ammunition, then calmly placed it back on the table, away from Reinhardt, out of reach. The smile disappeared from the German general's face. Patton looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something so quiet that a colonel standing nearby had to ask him to repeat it. He repeated it. Every person in that room remembered those exact words for the rest of their lives. Patton, a murderer always thinks everyone else is willing to become one. The room froze. Reinhardt blinked. Patton continued. Patton, that is why men like you always lose. The German general's confidence vanished. For the first time all day, fear appeared in his eyes. Real fear. Then an intelligence officer entered unexpectedly carrying another folder. A second folder, thicker than the first. He handed it directly to Patton. Patton opened it. His expression hardened. A witness had survived. Not one, several, and they were prepared to testify. Everything Reinhardt had denied was beginning to collapse. Before we go further, drop a comment right now. Should Patton have gone further, or did he cross a line? Tell us below. But the biggest revelation had not arrived yet, because hidden among the newly recovered documents was a name. A single name, one connected to a massacre far larger than anyone in that room realized. And when Patton read it, even he was shocked by what it meant. Spring 1946. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Entire cities had become fields of broken brick, twisted steel, and shattered glass. The smell of coal smoke still drifted through the cold morning air as Allied investigators worked to document crimes committed during the conflict. For Generalleutnant Karl Reinhardt, the battlefield was gone. Now came the courtroom. What happened next was not simple. Many Americans wanted swift punishment. Many Europeans demanded justice. But prosecutors faced a difficult problem. Evidence existed. Witnesses existed. Yet proving responsibility at the highest levels of command required more than rumors and accusations. It required testimony, documents, names, dates, signatures, and Reinhardt had spent years making sure others carried out his orders. Political complications appeared immediately. Some Allied officials argued that Germany needed experienced administrators to rebuild the country. Others insisted that overlooking war crimes would destroy the credibility of post-war justice. The debate became intense. Private meetings stretched late into the night. Arguments filled government offices. Justice was no longer just a legal question. It had become a political one. Then came the testimony, and everything changed. Among the witnesses was Private First Class James Walker, now 21 years old. The young soldier from Topeka, Kansas, sat in a crowded hearing room and described what American troops discovered as they advanced through territory once controlled by Reinhardt's forces. His voice remained steady, mostly, until he spoke about the victims. Then it cracked. Walker still carried Margaret's photograph in his wallet, the same photograph he had carried through France and Germany, the same photograph that reminded him why the war had been fought. When he finished speaking, the room remained silent. Several seconds passed before anyone moved. The testimony left a mark, not just on the judges, on everyone present. What happened next pushed the case forward. Investigators uncovered additional orders, additional signatures, additional witnesses. The chain of responsibility became harder to deny. Reinhardt's lawyers argued that he had simply followed military necessity. Prosecutors disagreed. The evidence spoke for itself. Weeks later, the verdict arrived. The courtroom filled before sunrise. Reporters packed every available seat. Soldiers stood along the walls. The air felt heavy. Nobody smiled. Nobody whispered. Then the judgment was read. He was found guilty. The sentence was death. He never hanged. The announcement shocked many observers. Appeals followed. Political negotiations followed. New priorities emerged as tensions between former allies began reshaping Europe. Justice had won, but only partially. Meanwhile, Patton learned of the verdict through military channels. One officer later recalled seeing him alone after reading the report. No celebration, no triumph, no satisfaction, only silence. Patton placed the document on his desk, looked out the window, and remained there for several minutes, because he understood something many others did not. A verdict could punish a man. It could not restore the lives already lost. It could not erase what had happened. It could not bring anyone home. For James Walker, the trial closed one chapter, but not another's. The memories remained. The faces remained. The questions remained. And as political forces quietly began working behind closed doors, a darker development was already taking shape, one that would leave survivors furious, one that would haunt the legacy of the case for decades, because Reinhardt's sentence was about to collide with something stronger than justice. Politics. 1948. 3 years after the war, Europe was changing again. The ruins remained, but a new conflict was already emerging. Former allies were becoming rivals. Governments worried less about the last war and more about the next one. And in that changing political climate, justice began to bend. Not openly, quietly, behind conference room doors, inside classified memoranda. Within negotiations, few ordinary citizens would ever see. For survivors of Nazi crimes, it felt like betrayal. The death sentence imposed on Karl Reinhardt did not survive the new political reality. Lawyers appealed. Officials reviewed the case. Committees reconsidered previous decisions. Months became years. Then the sentence was reduced. Then reduced again. The man once condemned to die would spend only a fraction of his punishment behind bars. For many families, the news was devastating. They had waited through investigations, testimony, trials, verdicts. Now they watched politics undo what courts had established. What happened next angered veterans across both Europe and America. In 1953, Reinhardt walked free, not exonerated, not declared innocent, simply released. The official explanation focused on stability and reconstruction. But survivors saw something different. They saw compromise. The political machinery had spoken, and the result felt hollow. For Private James Walker, the news arrived in a newspaper years after he returned to Kansas. He was married to Margaret by then, working long hours, building a life, trying to leave the war behind. But some memories refused to stay buried. Walker read the article twice, then folded the paper, and sat quietly at the kitchen table. The same faces returned, the same testimony, the same courtroom. Nothing had changed. Meanwhile, Karl Reinhardt settled into civilian life in Western Germany. The man who once commanded soldiers now lived in relative obscurity, at least publicly, but history has a strange sense of irony. The final chapter of Reinhardt's life carried none of the glory he once imagined. No military honors, no loyal crowds, no triumphant return, just silence. In October 1964, on a cold gray morning outside a small town near Munich, Reinhardt suffered a fatal stroke while walking alone along a narrow country road lined with autumn leaves. The weather was damp, the sky was overcast, a light wind pushed fallen leaves across the pavement. Few people noticed, fewer cared. The man who had once believed himself important enough to shape history died without ceremony, without power, without command, without an audience. Yet even that ending failed to resolve everything, because the deeper question remained unanswered. How many crimes had never been documented? How many orders had been destroyed before investigators arrived? How many victims never received names in official records? No courtroom could answer that. No verdict could erase it. And that uncertainty followed survivors for the rest of their lives. James Walker rarely spoke about the war as he grew older. Friends noticed it. Family noticed it. When conversations turned to Europe, he often became quiet. Not because he forgot, because he remembered too much. And decades after that loaded pistol slid across a wooden table toward Patton, one uncomfortable truth remained. Justice had reached Reinhardt, but only partially. The full truth of what happened under his command may have died with the men who carried it. And that unresolved question is exactly what Patton understood from the very beginning. The story of the loaded pistol was never really about the pistol. It was about a question General George S. Patton understood better than most men of his generation. What happens when power believes it is above accountability? On that rainy day near Frankfurt in March 1945, Patton saw something many others missed. Karl Reinhardt believed evidence could be hidden. Witnesses could be intimidated. Records could be destroyed. He believed history belonged to the men who survived. Patton believed the opposite. He understood that wars eventually end. Documents surface. Witnesses speak. Graves are opened. And sooner or later, somebody asks difficult questions. That was the real battle taking place inside that headquarters building. Not a struggle over a pistol, a struggle over truth. Years later, visitors walked among the rows of white crosses at the American military cemeteries across Europe. The grass remained perfectly trimmed. The markers stood in perfect lines. Thousands of names, thousands of stories, thousands of futures that never happened. Standing among those graves, the arguments of politicians seemed smaller. The excuses sounded weaker. The cost became impossible to ignore. That is part of Patton's legacy. Not simply battlefield victories, not simply tanks crossing rivers, but the belief that military success meant little if civilized nations abandoned the rules that separated soldiers from murderers. And that lesson remains relevant today. The same question Patton faced in 1945 is being asked today in conflicts around the world. The rules he fought to enforce are the same rules being debated right now. How should prisoners be treated? Who is responsible when civilians are harmed? Can military necessity excuse everything? Or are there lines that must never be crossed? Those questions remain unresolved, just as they were in 1945. And perhaps that is why this story still matters, because the ending is not clean. Reinhardt was convicted, yet he walked free. Evidence survived, yet some truths disappeared forever. Justice arrived, but not completely. History rarely gives perfect endings. It leaves fragments, questions, loose threads. For James Walker, the war never fully ended. He raised a family, built a career, lived a long life. But every March, according to relatives, he would quietly take out an old photograph. The same worn photograph of Margaret he carried through Europe. The edges remained creased. The image faded. The memories did not, because he remembered the cold rain, the tense silence, the loaded pistol on the table, and the moment one man refused to become what his enemy expected him to be. If this story stayed with you, share it with one person who loves history. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling us which part hit hardest. We read every single one. And somewhere beneath the quiet fields of Europe, among rows of white markers stretching toward the horizon, the story of Private James Walker remains a reminder that history is never really about generals alone. It is about the young men who carried the cost of every decision they made.